So this year, 2020, marks the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, an act of protest and violence regarded as a key turning point in the coming of the American Revolution. Revolutionary Spaces has a special connection to the massacre, which took place just outside the walls of the old State House and was for many years remembered on the anniversary of the Boston Massacre within Old South Meeting House. Last year, we made the decision as an organization to focus our programming in this anniversary year on the memory of Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native descent who was the first to die at the Boston Massacre. We opened a new exhibit about Attucks earlier this year. We had planned to mount a major public art installation that unfortunately had to be postponed, and we are still currently developing a new play that centers on Attucks' life. Over the next several months, our Reflecting Attucks programming initiative will delve into Attucks and his world and look at how generations of Americans have seen their own reflection in the image of Attucks, a man of mixed race standing in the face of fierce opposition. By remembering him as a martyr, a leader, and a courageous fighter, they fueled freedom movements that changed the course of American history. Today's program on liberty and sovereignty explores the struggles for liberty and sovereignty that gave shape to Attucks' world during the years leading up to the American Revolution. In our national imagination, in our collective memory, Attucks most often appears as an actor in the struggle for colonial rights that would culminate with independence in 1776. But that really was only one of three great freedom struggles underway in New England during the 18th century. To understand Attucks, at least it's the premise of this panel, that to understand Attucks, we must widen the aperture of our lens so that we can see the efforts of Native people to defend the sovereignty of their communities during the 18th century and see also the struggle of those in bondage to be free. By bringing all three struggles into view, perhaps we can understand better not only Attucks, but also the complex origins of our nation and the enduring questions with which we still grapple today. So to help us to unravel some of the complex threads that make up the tapestry I've just put in front of you, we are very fortunate to have a distinguished group of scholars, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panel right now. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, and I'm going to start with Chris Newell, who is the Executive Director and Senior Partner to Wabanaki Nations for the Smithsonian Affiliate Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine, and is a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township. Chris was one of our key scholarly advisors for the exhibit that I mentioned, and he also joined us last week as a featured speaker at our first Reflecting Attucks panel called A Man of Many Worlds. Welcome back, Chris. Chernoh Sesay is an associate professor of religious studies at DePaul University and is an early American historian by training and is currently writing a book titled Black Boston and the Making of African American Freemasonry, Leadership, Religion, and Community in Early America. Welcome, Chernoh. David Silverman, with whom I shared a dissertation advisor in graduate school, is professor of history at George Washington University. He's the author of many books, including This Land is Their Land, The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving. David was also one of the key scholarly advisors for the exhibit. So welcome, David. And last but not least, Serena Zabin is professor of history at Carleton College and is a longtime friend of Revolutionary Spaces. She is the author most recently of The Boston Massacre, A Family History, which was released at a very timely moment this past March, just in time for the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. So welcome, Serena. So I just want to dive right in with where I began and just start by asking our panel whether you agree with the premise that I sketched, that the 18th century, the world that Attucks knew in New England was defined not just by one struggle, the struggle for the rights and liberties of the colony within the British Empire, but three struggles. Does that premise make sense to all of you? And if so, perhaps you can just help us understand a little bit what those struggles were, what was at stake, and what they looked like, how they played in the 18th century. Why don't we start with Chernoh?
First, I want to thank Revolutionary Spaces, and thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for all of my colleagues, some of whom I knew previously and some who I newly met. This is great. I think, so uh, one way to think about these struggles is in terms of kind of rights, sovereignty, and abolition, these kind of three big categories. And I think a lot of recent work might start with those categories, but then would do a lot of work to, in some ways, not deconstruct those categories, but to begin to break down the complexity even with those three categories. However, if we do start with those categories, one frame that we can place all of them in is this frame of nation building. And so we find Crispus Attucks at this one particular moment that becomes pivotal in kind of the myth making of a new nation. And so along the lines of thinking about the creation of a new nation, obviously historians have talked about many different kinds of revolutions happening at the same time. That's something we can talk more about. But to just be brief and to open it up, I think those three themes, those three areas, as I think of them, rights, sovereignty, abolition, are very useful. Obviously, there is a lot of overlap between those three areas. And we can begin to talk about both the overlap of those useful categories, but also the ways in which those categories themselves can be further opened up.
Thanks, Chernoh. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add on that topic? Just sort of the top line. Does this make sense? The idea of three struggles.
I think so. And I think here it's important to distinguish between Native American struggles and African American struggles, and both of which are represented in Crispus Attucks's background. I think some of your listeners will be surprised to realize that there was slavery in colonial Massachusetts, and that there was slavery in every colony by virtue of a place being a colony. This is not to say that slavery was as important to the society and economy of a place like Massachusetts as, say, South Carolina or Barbados, but every single colony in the Atlantic world had slaves. And so for people who were held in bondage, their freedom struggle was to become free, right? To own themselves. And then after achieving that end, to achieve equality within the society that had previously enslaved them. That's very different than what most Native people in a place like Massachusetts were trying to achieve. They were trying to achieve sovereignty, self-determination, or rather to reacquire their sovereignty, which colonial society had robbed them of. For them, full equality within colonial society was in many ways the crystallization of colonization, right? Being subject to Massachusetts law would be a violation of their sovereignty. So whereas African Americans are trying to achieve freedom and equality, indigenous people are trying to achieve sovereignty, self-determination in terms of economy, culture, and politics. Equality or justice for African Americans and Native Americans was not the same thing. And I think that's an important point to take away from this story.
If I could just maybe cue up our next piece, to say also that that really one can't talk about the American Revolution and the themes that all of us kind of imagine are a part of it, including concepts of liberty and other things, without knowing that part of that story also, in fact, central to that story, is are these other struggles, that they're all part really of the same tale, right? That there is nothing about the development of British colonies and the British Empire in the 18th century that's not connected to both, attempts to acquire native land and also questions about slavery, both its extension and actually questions about its abolition. Both of those things are happening in the 18th century, and both of those are part of the story that will become the American Revolution.
Thank you all. I want to come back to David's point, if I may, that the Native American struggle for sovereignty was sort of a struggle to reacquire something that had been lost. And Chris, I'm thinking about the conversation in our last panel last week about the erasure of Native people from our memory of colonial New England. Without question, New England's Native peoples are highly visible in the sources and narratives for the early colonial period. Let's try to understand how different the landscape is and why it's different during the 18th century. Why are Native people significantly less visible in those sources by the middle of the 18th century?
So yeah, by the time of the 18th century, when it comes to at least the areas like Boston and southern New England, which had the larger population zones, Native people had already, dealt with colonization for quite a bit. There were genocides that occurred, the Pequot War being the first in the 17th century. The Native populations were dispossessed of land, 9 million plus acres in less than 100 years in southern New England. And so were resigned to not be able to live traditionally as they had, moving about seasonal migration, moving about the territory freely, and we're kind of locked into small areas of land. The beginning of that was praying towns, and then later on would come reservations in Connecticut, and then eventually in Massachusetts as well. Native people, were not considered Americans, and were oftentimes not allowed to even, be off the reservation without some sort of permission from some sort of colonial body of some sort. And for that reason, were seen as highly impacted because they were speaking English. They were because of the proximity to the neighborhoods of people of color within urban neighborhoods. There was a lot of mixing that was happening between Native and people of color, and so the impact of colonization, caused basically the Euro-American colonists to de-authenticate basically the existence of Native peoples. If they didn't appear as they did prior to colonization, they were no longer authentic anymore, which is why later on in the 19th century American conservation movement begins to collect items from museums. And in Boston museums, if you see a Native collection in a colonial museum, it'll be largely Plains and Southwestern tribes, because when those items were being collected, those were the less impacted tribes. And so there's this, kind of an outside body, a Euro-American body, a colonial body, trying to, basically, has the power after King Philip's War, especially, to determine who is Native and who is not. And within, especially cities like Boston, that was very much, in the hands of the colonists. However, in the time frame, you got to also remember that the city of Boston was very much dependent upon areas that were not as settled, like areas that would become the state of Maine, and rely on the tribes within those areas, sometimes fear those tribes within those areas. But the sovereignty of the burgeoning Americans was first recognized by Native people. So yeah, when it goes back to that last question of the multiple struggles that are going on there, Native peoples are trying to regain what was rightfully their self-determination. But non-Native peoples were trying to grapple with, what are they? And the first people to recognize the right of Americans to govern themselves were actually Wabanaki peoples, Passamaquoddies, and Mi'kmaq people.
Thanks, Chris. Clearly there's, oh, sorry, Chernoh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and piggyback on some wonderful points that have been made, specifically about some of the distinctions that we need to be clear about with respect to thinking about kind of the freedom struggles of African descended peoples and the freedom struggles of Native peoples to America. Somebody like Crispus Attucks is really interesting because he opens up the linkages between these kinds of things. So it is important, I think, to begin a conversation to think about these distinctions, but it's also important to think about how thinking about somebody like, oh my gosh, forgive me, I'm having a brain freeze here. Crispus Attucks, how he forces us, I think, to reconsider categories like sovereignty, especially if we're thinking about issues of citizenship and issues of cultural heritage. So in the case of many African descended people, by the time you get to the late 18th century, it is true that even though our demographics aren't exact or precise, most African descended people who are living in and around Boston by the late 18th century are probably native to America. But nonetheless, you still have, from the mid 18th century up to the late 18th century, significant numbers of African descended people who are being transported throughout New England from the Caribbean or directly from West Africa. So amongst African Americans as well, you do have these issues of trying to reclaim something that has been lost in a particular place that is not, that never fully recognizes you as a citizen. And so we see very interesting cases, right, of African Americans who look to Native Americans to try to reclaim some degree of sovereignty over themselves, or some recognition of kind of self-affirmation within a group outside of this kind of European settler colonial expansion. And there are a vast array of different examples of how that happens, but nonetheless, it's important to initially draw these distinctions, but also then talk about how somebody like Crispus Attucks forces us to consider the complexity of something like sovereignty or citizenship for a vast numbers of people in the late 18th century.
Nat, if I might piggyback on Chris's and Chernoh's comments here, because I think there's a lot of richness here to expand on. You know, your original question was, why are Native people on the eve of the American Revolution in Southern New England less visible than, say, we would assume for the 17th century? And there are lots of reasons for that. One is their populations were much lower than was the case a century before as a result of warfare, epidemic disease, but it's more than that. It's also the way that the larger society defined them or failed to recognize them as indigenous people. So take a guy like Crispus Attucks, for example, right? He's of both African or African American and indigenous descent. Well, we don't know how he defined himself, but we do know how the white people of a place like Massachusetts would have defined him. They would have defined him as Black or Negro. They would not have defined him as Afro-Indian. And here what we're seeing is the building blocks of a racial ideology that's been passed down to this very time, in that Blackness expands through mixing, right? So if you have a Black parent and a non-Black parent, you're still Black, right? I always use the example of Barack Obama. He's the first African-American president. Have you ever seen his mother? She doesn't count in the way that American society defines him racially. But the Native side of a person of mixed ancestry disappears through mixing. And that's part of a colonial ideology to make Native people disappear, thus diminishing their claims to the land while expanding the servile Black labor pool. And the problem that presented for indigenous people is that many indigenous people in colonial New England were enslaved alongside Africans from the 17th century onward, whether as prisoners of war or because they were purchased from other colonies. So when they produced children with the Africans they lived alongside, those children were defined by colonial society as not Indian, but rather as Negro or Black. At the same time, on the eve of the American Revolution, Native societies around Boston, in these praying towns, were being ripped apart by colonial society, in which colony-appointed guardians, courts, and creditors were forcing adults who had run into debt to serve as indentured servants to white masters, but they were also forcing them to sell their children into servitude. And so these communities are being gutted from within. And then when the children or the parents produce marriages and children with people of African descent, their identity disappears. And so that's a part of these complexities that have been raised thus far.
Thanks, David. That's a very, very helpful point. And I think you know, you've all been pushing at the interconnections between these categories and the interconnected nature of the struggles here, and that's absolutely right. And I want us to explore that in more detail as we move forward. Chernoh, can you help us understand a little bit more about the nature of the struggle against slavery in the 18th century? Just as with Native people, our audiences may be more familiar with what the lay of the land looked like in the 17th century than the 18th century. When we think about the struggle against the institution of slavery and against the condition of enslavement, our minds often gravitate to the 19th century. But help us understand what this looked like during the 18th century. And what somebody like Attucks might have been familiar with just in his milieu.
Well, that's a great question. And I just want to say before I begin to answer it that the struggles of Native peoples and of African Americans are always constant against colonialism and against enslavement. And the only reason that I want to emphasize that point at the beginning is so that we don't spend all of our focus on the revolutionary moment as a moment where somehow liberal ideas about human equality and freedom are absorbed by people of African descent or African Americans and people of Native American ancestry. That somehow it's only the American Revolution, right, that animates people's ideas about what it means to be free or to belong to a particular place. And so, having said that, you know, there's wonderful work that's being done by Gloria McMahon. And so, for example, she writes this article that talks about how rates of manumission in New England actually rise before you get something like the Declaration of Independence. So in many ways, I mean, I think this is really transformative when we think about the sources that are changing how people think about freedom. And I think this question of manumission, for example, is one way to address your question. Why are New Englanders, before you get the kind of formal onset of revolution, why are they beginning to manumit their enslaved laborers? And in terms of the patterns of people of African descent, both being manumitted and also running away, both of those increase over the course of the mid to late 18th century. And to add further complexity to the issues of thinking about rights and thinking about liberty, African American men tended to run away in larger numbers than African American women. But recent work has also shown that if you look at the actual cases, the children born to enslaved women stayed with the owner. And so demographically speaking, there are all sorts of factors in terms of personal experience and broader demographics that affected how people, men and women, were able to either go about trying to become free, or ways in which they had that freedom either prescribed or restricted based upon their kinds of personal circumstances. So the last point I will make is that I think you can make an argument that the people who are enslaved or being marginalized on the borders of these ever-expanding colonies, they are the ones who are constantly pushing these questions of kind of freedom and equality. And I guess as I'm thinking about it, I'll make one more point, and that is that the racialization of slavery that David talked about, I want to emphasize that in a particular way, because this emphasis on Blackness, I think, is part of a much longer process where that creates a transformation in the way in which people think about slavery itself. So over the course of the 18th century, the condition of slavery moves from just a condition along kind of a hierarchy or a spectrum or a ladder, if you will, to a condition that's seen somehow as kind of oppositionally diametric to the condition of freedom. Now, those are both rhetorical questions, but part of the thing that gives these categories of freedom and equality their power is this idea, especially amongst whites, that to be an enslaved person is to be a Black person. So as the distinction between slavery and freedom increases, I think you could also argue that the distinctions that are kind of worked out over the course of the 16th, the 17th, and the 18th century, the distinctions between Blackness and whiteness also become increasingly solidified. And those distinctions, I would argue, also occur along with the ways in which distinctions are made between European colonialists and the Native American population.
Thank you, Chernoh. Does anybody want to come in on this question? I actually want to turn to you for a moment, Serena. I deliberately wanted to enter into a conversation about liberty and sovereignty by talking about those struggles that are not traditionally part of our national narrative of the founding of the nation. But of course, liberty and sovereignty are words that are mobilized in the context of the sort of the political argument that will culminate with independence. Is it helpful to bring that conversation into dialogue with these other struggles, to see liberty and sovereignty as part of these multiple overlapping conversations?
Yes, mostly. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question and really interesting to think with, because you think about a word like liberty, right? And you start thinking, I'm just thinking about revolutionary spaces. We think about liberty trees, and we have liberty bowls, and we have Sons of Liberty. I mean, liberty is like everywhere. I think somebody said once, I think it's about nature, right? That it's like a sponge that sucks up ideology. I mean, I think that's what the word liberty is doing in the 1760s and 1770s. It can mean so many things. And some of the things that it meant for, people who are drinking out of liberty bowls or hanging out by the liberty tree, are not that closely tied to some of these other ideas, right, about individual freedom, and some of them really are. So there's a vision, I think it's maybe worth thinking, there's an idea about liberty that's kind of it's a communal vision, a communal idea of self-determination, right? That's really about the ability of a community to participate in the political life, right, of the larger state. And that's part of what white colonists are talking about when they say liberty, right? So that piece is there, as is a much more individual idea of liberty that's really about property, right? Which brings us really right back to these questions of slavery, that is really about one's right to securely hold on to property against the claims, at that moment of the state, okay? And so you've got both this communal and this individual idea. And I think when people say liberty, they're not really defining in their head what they mean when they say that, right? They're kind of pulling on all of these visions. But I think maybe, and just to pull these pieces together, that, we're talking about a moment after as probably most of our listeners know, right, after this great global war that comes to be known as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War that ends in 1763, when Britain is trying to solidify its claims to large amounts of native land, right, that the French have given up, but indigenous people have never given up there. And they're trying to centralize a larger empire. And so it becomes harder and harder, especially for white colonial men, to feel that they're either sharing in the power of the state, or and they're also losing their confidence that the state might not sort of arbitrarily flex its muscles and start taking away property. And when they start worrying about that, they're worried about property and taxes, and they're worried about property and people, right? So this is what I mean when I say that the American Revolution develops out of a whole set of concerns and fears about native land and about property and people. And these things are all coming together in this mixed up way.
I just want to add a little bit to that. A strange phenomenon started to happen as well as Euro-Americans started to seek liberty, to liberate themselves from English rule. They literally almost tried to find ways to culturally liberate themselves from Europe. And so the Sons of Liberty are, of course, associated with the Boston Tea Party and are associated, oftentimes reported as, dressing up as Native Americans. It was more of just kind of painting their faces black and things of that sort. But that appropriation of Native identities in areas where Native people were largely not present, like the city of Boston, is something that Americans would continue. And so later the Sons of Liberty become the Society of Red Men, and then later that becomes the Improved Order of Red Men, which is America's oldest fraternal organization. Ironically, even though they appropriated Native cultures, pretended basically and kind of wrote their own history of Native peoples and are structured that way, and they still exist today. It was a whites-only organization all the way until 1975, beginning way back in the 1830s. So you see this beginning during this period here, where Euro-Americans are having a bit of a struggle with who to define who an American is. What is an American? How is it different? And it's an interesting thing that what happens in places like Boston, where you see that assumption of an appropriation of Native identity as a way of severing the cultural ties with Europe, in the mode of liberation.
That's a great point, Chris. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box, so for our audience members who are putting questions and comments in there, please continue to do so. There have been a few questions about, can you help us understand Attucks' background in more detail? And that is a subject that we explored in much more detail in the last discussion, so I don't want to go too far down that road, but I just want to make sure that we're all understanding, this is somebody whose own background combines the experiences of Native people and African descended people, right? His father is an African born enslaved man who comes to the colonies. His mother is from New England's Native communities. We don't need to rehearse in detail all the complexity around how we can know and what we can't know, but I think it's important for people to understand his own vantage point on this. And I want to turn it back to the panel. So our charge in this conversation is really to think about the worlds of protest, the struggles that the political conversations that somebody like Attucks from this remarkable sort of mixed background, what he navigated and what it would have looked like to him. So I guess the question I want to ask the panel is, do we think Attucks was aware of all of these strands? We can see these connections. Was he aware of these multiple struggles, and how would he have been exposed? And how could we surmise, as a young man growing up in the 1730s and 1740s, that he would have navigated this world of overlapping struggles? Chernoh, since you took yourself off mute first, I'm going to kick that to you.
The short answer would be mobility. And so what do I mean by mobility? I mean that we can think about liberty or rights or struggles from a kind of erudite position where we assume that somebody has kind of written down a philosophical position, and that there's an archive of this document. But the reason I start with mobility is because I wonder if, by thinking about the choices an individual would have to make in order to find a job or to settle in a particular place without their presence in that place being questioned, what would that look like? I think the answer isn't merely a kind of pragmatics, that an individual is just reacting to all of these things and just trying to fit in. But I do think that if we're thinking about, kind of philosophies and ideologies that develop from the bottom up, that it's interesting to think about the moves that people have to make in order to gain employment or to settle in a place, particularly if they've been racialized as Negro or mulatto or even native. When you look at many runaway advertisements, some of those go to great lengths to try to describe the individuals that people are trying to get back, and try to in some ways get ahead of the moves that individual would try to make to avoid authorities. So I just say all this to say that the ways in which people were moving, and we even though we don't know a lot about Attucks, we can imagine that he is in fact on the move. What kind of worldview would come out of that kind of an experience? And would this particular kind of worldview help to contribute to somebody that might have some kind of critical position on the expansion of empire?
That's great. Anybody else? Serena?
Yeah, that's so interesting, Chernoh. I had not actually thought about it in those terms before, and it just sort of made all kinds of things click for me. And one of the things it made me think about was actually earlier work that I had done on African descended sailors, right, in the 1740s and 50s, many of whom are actually Spanish affiliated, right, but some of whom are also British, who actually spend a lot of time thinking explicitly as they move between empires, between the French and Spanish and British empires, exactly what it means to make claims about themselves and about imperial power. And they do so largely because of the ways in which they're traveling between, right? That there's something about that comparative experience that allows them to say, actually, I really want to make claims to my Britishness right now. That's going to be useful for me. That's going to make sense to the people I'm talking to, right? And I can actually be that person. But sometimes they'll say, I'm going to make claims to being actually Spanish right now. It's going to help me a lot more to be treated as a prisoner of war if people understand me to be Spanish. And that is a really, that thinking about travel there and thinking about mobility and movement is such a helpful way for helping us understand how somebody like Attucks, whom we can't particularly know, might have understood this world. Thanks. It was great.
I just want to add to that, going back to his younger days, there was a question in the chat I saw as well about how did indigenous communities see people of mixed ancestry. And in the 18th century, the tribes in southern New England are all matrilineal, which means they trace their descendancy through the mother. And that is still very much alive. That's very, very much a culturally distinct way of seeing one another. The idea of judging ourselves, our nativeness, by looks is an American phenomenon. Native people didn't go about deciding descendancy that way. Attucks's mother was Native. Therefore, he would have been raised with the idea through his mother that he belongs to his mother's tribe. He definitely would have had, did he outwardly identify that way? That's hard to guess. There's not a lot of information about that. But he would have been raised with the idea that, yes, absolutely, he is Native based on matrilineal descendancy. And, so he, right from his childhood, he is understanding this code switching and shifting between worlds that is going on all around him. And then when he self-liberates and goes out to sea, he's doing that, of course, as well. And as I mentioned in the last talk, he gets to see, imperialism and colonialism at different stages all throughout the world. So he knows what is in store for America should it stay under English rule, and what is in store for him as somebody that is identifying as an American, as a person of color, what that would be in that future. So there's in a lot of ways we kind of framed it as a radicalization because he's learning so much. His worldview is expanding so widely, and he would have been a very cosmopolitan individual with a very good understanding of the world.
I'd like to piggyback on this conversation just a little bit. I think one of the best pieces of evidence of whether someone with Attucks's background would have been keyed into these debates about the revolutionary crisis is how quickly both African Americans and indigenous people latched on to the universal egalitarian language of the revolution, appropriated it, and then used it to confront white revolutionaries with their own hypocrisy in the ways that they were tyrannizing those communities. And, enslaved Africans do it to claim their right to pursue independence, their right to liberty and equality. Native people use it to claim the right of their own independence and self-determination. I think what's more, we need to keep in mind that, Attucks works in a port town by the docks, and those areas were politically radical. And one of the reasons that they're politically radical is they experienced the tyranny of empire, sailors did, in a way that very few other people did. I think very few audience members are probably aware of the practice of the British Navy of sailing into port towns and then forcibly impressing sailors into military service against their will, a practice that the sailors themselves likened to slavery. It's not lifetime or heritable, but it's against their will. These kinds of impressment efforts would produce citywide riots and brawls in towns like Boston or New York or in the Caribbean islands. And so, Attucks was part and parcel of that kind of political and cultural milieu. Just one other point that I'd like to build on Chris's point. I take his point about matrilineality seriously, and it is important. I do think it's also worth noting, though, while we're talking about race, that the practice of Black Americans intermarrying into Native communities did produce a great deal of tension during this period within Native communities for a couple of different reasons. One is that Black men who married into these communities, and it's almost always Black men who marry into these communities rather than Black women. There's a disproportionate number of Black men to women in Southern New England. There's a disproportionate number of Native women to men because Native men are dying at such high rates in military service and in whaling. When Black men marry into Native communities, they very often want to exercise private ownership of land, which is antithetical to Native communal landholding practices, and it's a real tension. What's more, they're almost always monolingual English speakers, and Native languages are in real danger during the period of Attucks's life, in part because of that practice of forcing Native children into indentured servitude in English homes. And so in many respects, intermarriage poses the last great risk to Native languages. And so there's a lot of tension over Afro-Indian marriages during this period, I think for perfectly understandable reasons.
So lots of nodding along as David was speaking. Did anybody have anything that they wanted to add? So I think that several of the points that have been raised are about the particular intersections that Attucks might have experienced in navigating these overlapping worlds of struggle and protest. And so I wanted to explore that in a little bit more detail. And Serena, I've been thinking about your book, about the Boston Massacre recently, thinking about it a lot. It's a great book, but you've written, I think, a history not of the massacre, but of the occupation of Boston by the regular army during the period between the fall of 1768 and the Boston Massacre in 1770. And it's just made me think about the experience of somebody like Attucks, who you know, his native ancestry. I mean, he had the experience of growing up in occupied lands from a different point of view. So if we can locate Attucks in Boston in that period of British occupation, would he have felt a sort of uncomfortable ringing of bells there, or are those experiences so divergent that he wouldn't have made that connection?
So I love to think with this idea. You know, I'd say, and maybe actually Chris and others can help unpack this a little bit from the other side. You know, the heart of my book, so to speak, is really that the presence of troops in Boston during that 4 years of occupation was kind of a mixed bag for Bostonians, right? That politically active men, some of those guys that David was just talking about, and, you know, also Sons of Liberty, they hated having them there. But there are plenty of young single women who saw them as potential marriage material, right? They were perfectly happy to see the presence of these men come into Boston, you know, for some of the same reasons David just pointed to, because there's actually a sex imbalance. There are fewer white men than white women in Boston in this moment. And, you know, women are looking for marriage partners. So, you know, I don't want to say that occupation in that particular military way is a monolithic experience. And I think thinking with that would be interesting. I mean, in what ways then was occupation of native land over this much longer period also maybe not a monolithic experience? In what way maybe does the culture shift, right, as the result of these kinds of occupations? In what ways do families change? That's the heart of what I'm interested in thinking about in this very short time span. But I think, you know, even as we're talking about mixed race families, we can see that there's some change that's going on there too. But I think, so I'll open it up and maybe leave it to some of other people to talk about occupation over a much longer period than those 4 years.
Chris or David, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit on it. Yeah, I mean, you know, essentially, you know, the city of Boston was essentially always occupied territory from Native perspectives. You got to remember that all of the governance that was coming was coming out of the city of Boston for the most part. Treaties that were being signed in Boston, and ridiculous things were happening, like bounty proclamations when things were not going well. You know, so in the Massachusetts Old State House, the Fifth Bounty Proclamation was signed in the 1760s, asking for bounties for the scalps of Penobscot men, women, and children during a very short time when Spencer Phipps was in charge. He was lieutenant governor for 24 years and only served as interim governor, or, you know, in power for 2 very short periods. But during one of those periods, he declared war on the Penobscots and asked for scalps of the men, women, and children. And when it comes to the craziness about what was happening with England in other parts of the territory, English were, of course, trying to make their way into what would become the state of Maine. The Bostonians wanted to control what would become the state of Maine. With this bounty proclamation, things were happening. The Penobscots actually were generally friendly to the Americans. A lady named Margaret Moxa, a Penobscot woman, actually gave information about the British to the Americans that helped them during that preoccupation time. James Cargill came from Boston with the Fifth Bounty Proclamation, found her and murdered her and turned her scalp in for bounty. So, a woman that was helping the Americans, because of, the Bounty Proclamation ended up getting slaughtered, just for her scalp. And this is what I talk about when I talk about urban areas. So Boston was essentially occupied territory for Native peoples, to the point where even to come into town, you had to be the right type of Native. Abenaki leaders that signed certain treaties were actually not considered leaders within their own communities. And so laws got put in the city of Boston that didn't allow Native Americans to be on the streets of Boston during the daytime. And one of the reasons why is because the other chiefs which were coming down to say, no, these are not the rightful leaders, they cannot sign these documents, but they were being allowed to anyway. So by making it illegal to keep them off the streets, it was an easy way to arrest them, get them out of there and sign with who they wanted to. And that's a law that was actually on the books until only just a couple of years ago. Boston still has the remnants of this idea of occupation of native land as colonial territory, even in the way it's still structured in some of the old laws.
I'm reluctant to imagine that Crispus Attucks would empathize with white New Englanders because his people, his indigenous ancestors had their land occupied, and now white New Englanders were being occupied by the British Army. After all, it was white New Englanders who had displaced Native people, so that'd be quite a feat of transference. What I would say though is that Attucks is part of a community of port laborers, dockside workers, and many of them are deeply resentful towards redcoats for driving down their wages when they take moonlighting jobs on the docks. And I mean, that alone is enough reason to spur hostility between the two groups.
Am I allowed to just jump in and say, really, yep, we have no evidence for that moonlighting story? I just need to say that.
Please go on.
I defer to this.
Sorry,
all of these issues. Let me say.
I know it's from this footnote from the 30s, I think, that was cited with no from what's his name, who wrote on labor in early America, Richard, whatever his name is, come to me. Yeah, so we actually don't know that. We don't actually know that happened. We know that soldiers did work. We know that we know that there were conflicts between civilians and soldiers. We don't know really that they were over wages. So nor do we have any evidence that local, rope yard workers, any of those people, were actively hiring soldiers because they thought that they could pay them less, right? They didn't look at them and think, oh, here's a way to shave a little off the bottom line. So that piece is not so there, but I'm not going to disagree with the larger argument, which is to say that Crispus Attucks, as a man who's spending his time around the docks, right, and among other sailors, was as likely to pick up some of those politics, right, and some of that hostility about what it means to be grabbed into the British Empire as anybody else.
If I can jump in and approach this question of occupation not from the occupation of actual physical space, but thinking about this in a kind of an imaginary way. So great work has been done, Parkinson, about reading the middle of the newspapers. And that when you read the middle of the newspapers, one of the things that stands out, I mean, there's just mounds of evidence of this, that there's fear of revolt, that indigenous people might somehow, bring social unrest, that people of African descent might rebel against their owners, and that Hessian troops might, side with the British. So if even if I go on a limb and say that Crispus Attucks was able to read, even if he wasn't able to read, I don't think it's too much of an imaginative step to imagine that he knew from other people, at least, what was being printed in these newspapers about somebody like him, somebody who's at the intersection of these different cultures that are both seen as threatening to whites and to empire. And so I think with that kind of knowledge, right, if we're trying to kind of reconstruct his intellectual world, I think it's safe to say, or at least to imagine in a very kind of useful way, somebody like Attucks thinking about less about occupation, but more about fear. And so fear, we are in fact talking about how people are imagining other people in their space, right? What that looks like, whether or not the fear is founded or unfounded. You have this contestation over how people are imagining space. And to think that he wouldn't have a sense of those kinds of the debates, I think isn't doing him justice as a person. And so if we then take that step to say, okay, this is a guy who has some sense of how he's understood, how his position is understood, not just in Boston, but in a kind of broader imperial world, then I think it's far less of a step to think of him as somebody who would be quite sensitive to various changes over time regarding debates about occupation or about various kinds of slights or impositions that people feared.
Chernoh, those same newspapers are, of course, filled with the word slavery during the 1760s and 1770s, as colonial commentators describe their own position within the British Empire as analogous to that of enslaved people. What is it like? What would it have been like for someone like Attucks to have read those words? I mean, I think I'm sort of wanting to explore the same kind of overlap, right? Occupation is rhetorically appropriated as an experience of white colonists. Here, enslavement is being appropriated rhetorically. But for someone like Attucks, who's experienced both occupation and enslavement at firsthand, it must be galling, right? How do enslaved people and their allies react to that rhetorical strategy during the 1760s and 1770s?
Well, I think you put that quite brilliantly, Nat. I mean, an easy example would be the petitions that African Americans write from 1771 up to 1777. So this is only 6 years. The petitions start before kind of formal hostilities, and they continue into actual hostilities. And they change in tone over time. They become far more insistent, far less pragmatic, far more direct and determined. They're written by a group of African Americans who are organized in a whole variety of ways, and the group of African Americans who comes together to write those probably had assistance, aid, were working with whites in using the language of kind of liberal protest, using this language of human rights and natural equality. And so what's also interesting is even as those petitioners are making these explicit critiques using a language of equality and rights, they are also recognizing that the condition of enslavement is contingent and conditional. And so if you look at manumission records, for example, different people go about freeing their slaves. The word manumit means to free. Different people go about freeing their slaves in different ways. Some people actually say in their wills that instead of kind of freeing the person that they own, they're going to give that person to somebody else, and they might hope that that person takes care of their enslaved person. In other cases, they leave their enslaved person with something. Now it's interesting because going back to the early 18th century, Massachusetts law actually disallowed manumission unless an owner was willing essentially to put up the money within kind of this broader kind of social network to support that enslaved person. So there's all kind of paternalistic politics that went into the freeing of enslaved people that I'm sure shaped the way in which people of color were thinking about freedom in broad universal terms, but also in very kind of local pragmatic terms.
And just to piggyback off that a little bit, we got to remember that even though the Euro-Americans were trying to sever their ties, with their European ancestry, they were very much, living by using the English language and living by the blueprint of the English language, which is all about land ownership. Wealth is, counted by how much, land you accumulate back at that time, and land and other things, and ways, basically that's how your wealth was measured. And the system that was being set up was for landowners to only be white male Christians. That goes back to the 17th century. And by keeping natives from owning land, using census records to call them mulatto, colored, anything but their own tribe, to reduce the number of natives, to take more land. That was the whole purpose of everything. And so that's one of the things we got to remember, is that the framework of what was going on when it comes to the ideas of freedom was still to keep the power in the hands of white male Christians, who were the original voters of this country. With the signing of the Constitution, that did not guarantee everybody the right to vote. In fact, there was just one special class. White male Christian landowners typically were the only voters in every state. So that's the system that was created from the colonization of England, the idea of land ownership and wealth accumulation and all of this, with the abolition movement gaining strength and freedom of people of color, there was still a lot of local resentment or just trying to fight away from the idea of people of color owning land. And if there was an instance of that happening, there was usually some way that there was an encroachment upon that land, usually illegally. So it was really all about, it seems almost simple, but that was one of the greatest things to be after, was to have your own land to own, to have your freedom. That was where you considered you had freedom.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat box here, which has been very active. Kudos to all of you who are contributing there. I want to save just a couple of minutes at the end to think about memory. And so I'm just going to ask one more question in this zone of sort of connections across these various struggles. And it's a question that we asked at the end of last week's panel, which is speculative by nature. And so Chris, you'll have a second whack at it if you want, but you don't have to. But it's really just to to ask you all, here we have Crispus Attucks, right, a man of mixed Native American and African descent, who'd been born into bondage and self-liberated as a young man, and had spent his life as part of the rough and tumble maritime labor force of the Atlantic world. And he finds himself at in King Street on the night of March 5th, 1770, and grappling with redcoats. What do we think what do you all think he was fighting for in that moment? Serena, do you want to take a first stab at it?
Oh, I was afraid that was going to happen. I feel just like one of my students. No, not me. I'm so reluctant to speculate on this, and so maybe I'll talk a moment about why, which is that I fear often over ascribing political knowledge to anyone in the past, and perhaps that's because I'm spending a lot of time thinking about people in our moment who are not actually incredibly politically aware, and they live this through their worlds, right? And little pieces of things touch them and don't. So, we know that some of the people who were in the street that night were there because other people were there, right? Not for any political reason, but because, they're like, oh, what's going on, right? In that very way in which crowds come together. We also know, though, that there are a lot of descriptions of Attucks coming in a much more, what should we say, deliberate way, right? Coming up the street with, with some kinds of wood pieces or something. And, did he think that he was striking a blow for liberty? No, right? I don't think anybody did. That wasn't the conversation, right? At the moment. But did he think that he was participating in a communal action in which actually he had something to say and something to do as a soldier, possibly as a man of mixed race, as a sailor and as a man of mixed race? I do think so, right? That he was there because he chose to participate in this crowd, to be part of this community. But more than that, I'm reluctant to speculate, but I leave that to others.
I suppose I could be blamed for evading the question. But in some ways, we're asking the question because he's come to play such a prominent role in the various myths and fictions of America. So in some ways, even if somebody found some document that was to answer this question in a kind of a definitive fashion, debates about him would continue. So I think it's important just to make that point, even as we try to speculate on what he might have been thinking, what he might have been doing. And so there, I would just agree with the way Serena kind of answered the question. That he was certainly asserting himself, and given the context, given the timing in which he asserted himself, that came to be extremely significant. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should try to determine or over-determine what his motives were for being there, but certainly he was there and he was active.
David?
Yeah, I would add to that, he's part of this community, right? And so everyone in the community is there, and he's there. We might add, how many of these guys had liquid courage that night? Did that factor into all of this, right? I mean, look, we're talking about dock workers here. We know the culture of that community, and that doubtlessly was a factor here. I should also note that not knowing exactly what he was thinking that day is not particular to him as a man of color. Historians have devoted an awful lot of ink to the question of why men fought in the Continental Army. Were they doing it for pay? Were they doing it primarily for land bounties? Did they believe in the ideology of the fight? And these debates go on and on and on, and we don't know because so few of them said anything about it. So we have to intuit it through this scrap of evidence or that scrap of evidence. I think it's also worth noting here that an awful lot of Native people got involved in the revolutionary cause, even when they had no direct stake in it. Now, we're most familiar with those who fought on the side of the British. They had a real direct stake in it, because who won this war would determine the fate of their independence and land. But for Native people who lived surrounded by white revolutionaries, they don't have a choice in this matter. They have to side with their white neighbors, or else they're going to have a really tough time of it, even more of a tough time of it than they've already had up to this point. As a result, the community in Massachusetts that volunteered the highest percentage of its men of fighting age to the revolutionary cause was Mashpee on Cape Cod, Mashpee Wampanoags, because they knew that they had to cultivate some political goodwill with their white neighbors if they were going to chart a path forward. Likewise, so many African Americans volunteered for the revolutionary cause, not because they necessarily thought they were going to gain the right to vote afterwards, but because they wanted their freedom, and they thought this might be a step toward that end. And so, you know, Attucks is operating within a similar milieu.
Chris, did you want to have a chance to chime in on this?
Well, I mean, you know, everybody's put it out there really well that, you know, we can theorize it, and it is a very complicated, you know, there is no single cause that you know, that we can identify that brings him to the Boston Massacre, but we can surmise that there's a whole lot of reasons that he likely had for being there. And it has to do with you know, the complexity of the society that he was in, and, you know, like I was saying, the code switching he's doing back and forth because of these different worlds that all exist in the same place. But yes, he was part of the Boston community, and you know, and I also, you know, go back to his matrilineal descendancy, that his mother is Native, and so, you know, the landowners for Native peoples at that time still on the reservations were women. That's one of the reasons why the tension David was mentioning before of Native women marrying African American men caused such tension. It's because of the women were considered the landowners. And so he actually, you know, in my mind, from his childbirth has a tie to the land physically here in America, through his matrilineal descendancy.
We're coming up toward the end, and so I think you know, there's all kinds of ways of getting at the theme of memory, but maybe the easiest, and this is a theme we're going to be exploring in much greater detail in upcoming panels, sort of the next segment of the conversation that we're going to be engaging in. But maybe just to cue that up, I can just close by asking the panel this question. We've spent quite a lot of time tonight trying to place Attucks in multiple unfamiliar contexts, or familiar to early Americanists perhaps, but not so much to the average American who may have heard about Attucks once or twice, but hasn't really studied it in detail. Why does it matter? Does it matter how we remember Attucks today, and why?
I think it matters as somebody that works in the field of decolonizing histories and re-indigenizing histories. You know, we have been teaching foundational mythology, you know, about America ever since America was founded. The first Thanksgiving narrative, you know, Columbus discovering America, you know, these types of things. You know, so for me, it's about putting Native people back into the last couple of 100 years where Native people have been there throughout. And the American Revolution is definitely one of those places where Native people exist. And it wasn't just within Native communities or, on Native land, Native held lands, but also within, the growing Euro-American communities, that were establishing themselves as the points of leadership. So yeah, I mean, I love that we're complicating the story now, that it's not the cut and dry version that we've been teaching in the public schools since the 19th century, that we're being more intelligent about how we're thinking about the days of the 18th century and the growth and birth of America.
I just want to piggyback on that. That was great, Chris. Attucks has been contested in American history. He's with us, and by paying more attention to the complexities, even the silences, the interesting questions that are raised by studying him, forces us to, as Chris points out, really confront the complexities of American history. Even if you don't think of nationalism as something that's kind of mythic in the ideological sense, certainly it's something that's contested. And in order to understand how those contests for ideology have played out over time, I think you have to pay attention to somebody like Crispus Attucks.
I want to give Serena the last word, so I'm gonna cut in here. Here to what both Chris and Chernoh had to say, and to it, I would just add this: when we whitewash American history, or as the current president wants, when we turn it into just a training ground for little patriots, we're actually hurting people. We're certainly hurting students of color who don't get an opportunity to see themselves in the story of their country, and we're hurting white people, because we're not exposing them to a complex history in all of its complexity. Our job is not to spin a patriotic myth. Our job is not to oversimplify a complex past. Our job is to capture a complex past in all of its complexity. And I can't think of a better vehicle for capturing that complexity than Crispus Attucks.
Okay,
Serena,
now I feel
the
the
last
weight.
word.
Oh gosh. All right. Well, I'll say then, both as a last word and as an appreciation of this conversation, that actually there's this is hard work to to sort of pull out Attucks, think about who he was beyond questions of myth, or looking at questions of myth itself. But that doing this kind of historical work is hard, and it's hard for a reason. It's hard in part because, as Chris pointed out, there were deliberate erasures generally of Indigenous people, right? In Boston, it was hard because there was, as David, I think, opened with, and we all know too, right? There were then later deliberate erasures of the history of slavery in Massachusetts. But I think it's worth just pointing out, or maybe I feel like this is my job right now, to say that this kind of erasure of Attucks as somebody who mattered was there from the very beginning. And because this is the moment, right, that within a couple months of his death, that John Adams says in that trial, right, where he's defending the soldiers who shot Attucks, that Attucks is one of that number of people, right? That motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, outlandish Jack Tars, right? All these people who are not real Bostonians, the people who don't really count. And it's at that moment that the story about who gets to really be a Bostonian starts to be set, right? And the work that Revolutionary Spaces and all of you are doing here is an attempt to dig back 250 years of stuff that's solidified pretty hard. So I want to thank all of you, and especially Nat, for the work that you do here. It's hard, and there's a reason for that.
Well, thank you, Serena. You can have the last word anytime. No, thank you all for a really rich and challenging conversation. And again, this is a step on a journey. I hope that we'll be able to continue the dialogue. So we have reached the end of our time here today, but as I mentioned, we're going to, over the next several months, continue to delve into Attucks' world and look at how generations of Americans have seen their own reflection in his image. So to our audience, if you enjoyed the program today, we do in fact have more opportunities ahead for you to stay in contact with these very panelists. So let me just call out a few of those. In addition to being Executive Director of the Abbey Museum, Chris Newell, as he mentioned before, is involved as the Education Director with the Accommod Educational Initiative, and we are looking forward to continuing the work that we're engaged in with Accommod and partnering with Chris and his colleagues to rethink how we ensure that our visitors know that Native history is American history and how we tell those stories in our spaces. David Silverman will be back as for a special member view event in early October to discuss his research, as well as his recent book, This Land is Their Land. We are at Revolutionary Spaces in a multi-year collaboration with Serena Zabin on Witness to the Revolution, an immersive three-dimensional digital game about the Boston Massacre that is now under development. So hopefully there will be more about that coming soon. And although he may not know it yet, we also hope to bring Chernoh Sesay back to talk more about Black Freemasonry in connection with The Petition, a short play about Prince Hall that premiered at the Old State House last summer, and which I think he may have quite a lot to say. To all of you out there, please visit our website at revolutionaryspaces.org to learn more about the next panel coming up very soon, to explore digital content related to Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre, and to find out about upcoming activities and experiences. And if you are not already, I hope you'll make sure that you're following Revolutionary Spaces on social media and that you are paying attention to our newsletters, which come out fairly regularly, where you can get updates about more programs. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our fabulous audience. And until next time, stay well.